Welcome to our new season, Innate, How Science Invented the Myth of Race. This is episode 2, Calamity in Philadelphia. Before we start, a content warning for our listeners. This episode covers topics, stories, and historical details that you might find difficult or disturbing. Last summer, I took a field trip with our producer, Mariel Carr, to a place called the Lazaretto. We were shown around by David Barnes, a historian and friend of this podcast.
You get the impression that this was some kind of significant place. And then if we turn around to face the Lazaretto, so we're facing north here, what we would have seen in 1801 when this station opened was an elegant, stately, and very symmetrical station. So, watch the goose poop.
Oh, yes. Okay. Yeah.
I changed into my gardening clothes.
There we go. Yeah.
Smart.
Wise. Very
Especially
wise.
with the high water table.
The Lazaretto is just down the road from the airport, right off of I-95. But if you squint, it pretty much looks just how it did in 1801. Beautiful, stately, peaceful.
So if you imagine no jet planes taking off overhead,
Yeah.
no Interstate 95, a couple blocks away, this is just a quiet,
Yep.
placid place.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of airplanes.
Yeah, right. I know but you're right.
Until the next ship arrives.
Right. The Lazaretto doesn't make it onto most Philadelphia history tours, but it should. It's the oldest surviving quarantine station in the country, and it's beautiful. The main building is this massive late Georgian-style manor with red brick and black shutters on the windows, and it has 2 adjoining wings that stretch out an equal length in both directions. It was named after the lesser-known Lazarus, patron saint of lepers, and it was built in 1801 in response to 4 deadly yellow fever outbreaks in Philadelphia.
It was an existential crisis. In 1793 and again in 1798, somewhere around 5,000 Philadelphians died. And we're talking about epidemics that lasted a couple of months. So a tenth of the city's population just dropping dead within 2 months. There was lots of talk about Philadelphia being uninhabitable, as being essentially not a place fit for human habitation. So the city was facing long odds, and this quarantine station was a big part of their response. It was a defiant gesture, a refusal to simply die or fade away.
The Lazaretto was built in 1801 to save Philadelphia. But when yellow fever first hit in 1793, there was no grand estate to save the day. Instead, the city relied on its new free Black community to provide essential services and nurse the sick and dying. And it was all predicated on a myth of innate racial difference. Chapter 1. A short account of the malignant fever. After I left the Lazaretto, honestly, I wanted to go back and stay there for like a short vacation. And then I thought to myself, Alexis, are you unwell?
I actually had the same thought.
Oh, hi, Mariel.
Oh, hi, Alexis. I mean, it was very peaceful there, and since there isn't currently a yellow fever outbreak, I think that helped set the scene there.
Thankfully.
So, we didn't really get an accurate picture of yellow fever quarantine life, but I do have this pamphlet that paints a pretty devastating portrait of Philly during that first epidemic. Do you want to read some of it?
Sure. It's called Short Account of the Malignant Fever Lately Prevalent in Philadelphia, with a statement of the proceedings that took place on the subject in different parts of the United States. Clearly, short doesn't refer to the title, but anyway, it begins, Dismay and affright were visible in almost every person's countenance. Most of those who could, by any means, make it convenient fled from the city. Of those who remained, many shut themselves up in their houses and were afraid to walk the streets. Some of the churches were almost deserted and others wholly closed. The coffee house was shut up, as was the city library and most of the public offices. So basically, it was just like Philadelphia in 2020, except no internet.
Right, and there were some other small differences. We should probably explain what this disease was like, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so it caused fevers, dark urine, vomiting, bleeding from the mouth, nose, and eyes. Its telltale symptom was jaundice, hence the name, yellow fever, and it was extremely contagious. Most people who got it did survive, but if you got the lethal form, you had a 50% chance of dying within 10 days. So now we know yellow fever is spread by mosquitoes, but we didn't know that in 1793. And there were some wild theories being thrown around.
The deaths came from coffee beans rotting in the ships, and they got sick. But the sickness kept going.
So this is Crawford Wilson. He works in Old City, Philadelphia, and often shares the yellow fever story with visitors.
So the next thought was that in the early morning fog, this was in that fog.
So in the midst of all this chaos and confusion, one man stepped up to take charge, Benjamin Rush. Now, you might know Rush as a founding father, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence.
Benjamin Rush was also the leading medical person in this area. In fact, there was no second place. He was the guy.
Things were really dire, and Rush was desperate to save the city from this disease. A huge problem was finding people to nurse the sick and the dying.
Right, no one wanted to do it. It was way too risky.
Unless, of course, you were immune. And if a whole group of people were immune, well, even better. And that's exactly what Benjamin Rush thought, that Black people, across the board, could not get yellow fever, that they were innately immune because of their race. And so, in the city's hour of need, he turned to two prominent Black preachers he considered his friends, Richard Allen and Absalom Jones. And he asked them to step up, help out.
And they did. But it came at great personal cost, because, spoiler alert, Benjamin Rush was wrong. Black people could get yellow fever, and they did, and many of them died. So it's kind of impossible to escape this yellow fever story when you do anything related to history or science in Philadelphia.
And we do both. So we knew the basics, but we realized that whenever we usually hear this story, it's almost as if the Black community had been frozen in time. They're an afterthought. So for this story, we decided to do something a little bit different. To start this by telling you what the Black community was up to before yellow fever broke out. Chapter 2. The Founder You Never Heard Of. 1793 was a time of tremendous political change and possibility for the growing free Black community in Philadelphia, a community led by Richard Allen. So Mariel and I decided to take another field trip to Richard Allen's old stomping grounds, Mother Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church. Mother Bethel, for short.
Welcome to Mother Bethel.
Hi. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, no problem. Okay.
This is Crawford Wilson again. He's a docent at Mother Bethel and has become a bit of an expert on Richard Allen. The church is in Old City, a few blocks from Independence Hall and the homes of people like Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson.
So at Mother Bethel, we might get more visitors than any church in Philadelphia, and I'm telling you, it's for real.
Yeah.
We get them by the busloads, you know.
The congregation was founded in 1794, right after yellow fever. It's had 4 different church buildings in this spot since then. The first one was a repurposed blacksmith shop that was pulled here from its original spot by horse and carriage. In the church museum, there's a painting of Richard Allen preaching in that building with an anvil in the center of the floor.
Yeah, this was the Black community. So basically, everybody walked to church. Most of the Blacks, we're talking Old City, Philadelphia.
Yes.
There was no West Philly.
Right.
There was no North Philly, right? We lived here.
Mother Bethel is the oldest AME church in the country. and the oldest church property continuously owned by African Americans.
So this inscription up here,
Yes.
is that a, tell us about it.
Richard Allen designed that. That was his words. God our Father, Christ our Redeemer, man our brother.
So when we told Crawford Wilson we wanted to know more about Richard Allen, he connected us with Richard Newman, a historian who wrote Freedom's Prophet, Bishop Richard Allen, the AME Church, and the Black Founding Fathers.
He's a founder of a lot of key institutions within the Black community. Black churches, Black reform organizations, Black self-help and philanthropic societies. He's trying to help the African American community in Pennsylvania transition from slavery to freedom, and he's pushing for new ways of understanding democracy. So he's challenging a lot of the founders to imagine the nation as truly a republic of equals, and imagining that process of emancipation as encompassing equality.
Richard Newman thinks of Richard Allen as one of the founding fathers of the United States, just one most people have never heard of.
Ben Franklin knows who Richard Allen is. George Washington does too. Richard Allen is very mindful of their presence, and when he writes pamphlets and gives speeches, he's thinking about them as an audience. Even if he doesn't have a political office, he thinks that his vision is absolutely essential to the success of American democracy.
And there's a reason for that. Richard Allen was a free Black man in Philadelphia at a time when what Black freedom would look like was still an open question. And he was uniquely suited to be a leader in the community and hold his own with men like Benjamin Rush and Benjamin Franklin. Allen was born into slavery in 1760. He grew up in Delaware, enslaved by a man named Stokely Sturgis. Now, a couple of things about this experience shaped who Allen would become. One was that Stokely Sturgis enslaved fewer people than some others, so most of the people Allen knew were white, and he got used to being around them. The second thing was that Stokely Sturgis was a Methodist, and once Allen earned his trust and convinced him religion wouldn't threaten his work, Sturgis let him become a Methodist too.
He really feels like Christianity and the evangelical revival circuit liberated his mind, and then allowed him to liberate his body through kind of strategic interaction with his master. So he gets his freedom, his manumission papers, by secretly challenging his master to allow anti-slavery preachers to come to his house in Delaware. So Richard Allen had to set this up. He couldn't just say, I'm going to bring anti-slavery preachers to your house and they're going to lecture you.
They came to the house and they read the famous sermon from the book of Daniel.
Thou art weighed in the balances and found wanting. So God is taking your measure and see that you're a slaveholder that violates the Bible in many ways. And so you're going to be struck down and sent to hell. And this scares Richard Allen's master so thoroughly that he agrees to write up a manumission document for Richard Allen and his brother. So Richard Allen learns that strategic protest, framed the right way, can achieve great results.
By the mid-1780s, Richard Allen was a free man, preaching in the Methodist Church.
And they were so impressed with him, they made him an exalter, which means he was allowed to preach. And he basically walked all the way up to Philadelphia, doing what he could do to stay alive and preach.
Two historic events made Allen feel hopeful in his early days in Philadelphia. The first happened right before his arrival, but it still felt fresh: the Declaration of Independence. Now, Allen hoped it would mean a racially egalitarian society, full equality across the color line.
The first public readings of the Declaration are on Philadelphia street corners. So into the 1780s, there's this real fierce sense of ownership, possessiveness about the Declaration. If any place in the nation should use the Declaration to challenge slavery and racial inequality, it should be Philadelphia and Pennsylvania.
The second historic event was the Gradual Abolition Act of 1780. Now, that was progress, but it was slow. It's literally in the name of the law. The free Black community in Philadelphia was growing, and many white leaders, founding fathers like Washington and Hamilton and Jefferson, were watching. They wanted to see how emancipation played out. Would it be successful?
People like Franklin, while they're sympathetic to abolition, they have some kind of racialist notions, which define African Americans outside of the mainstream. They have to prove their educational worth. They have to prove their value as citizens first and foremost.
In other words, abolition was one thing, full equality and citizenship was another. Richard Allen approached everything strategically, like he did with Stokely Sturgis.
He talks to Franklin in terms of experimentation. He says, we just want you in white society to engage in an experiment in Black freedom. So you can think about him really understanding Franklin as a scientist. But he also challenges Jefferson more forthrightly on philosophical grounds. Richard Allen says that if I'm going to be this public figure, this kind of founding era influence maker, then I've got to make these arguments and step onto the public stage and challenge racism and slaveholding beliefs wherever I see them.
Allen was also hopeful about the equality he saw within the Methodist Church. Blacks and whites coexisted side by side. But then white church leaders started reevaluating Black freedom too.
Should masters in the church be allowed to retain enslaved people? What about the color line within church pews? Should Blacks be able to sit where they want?
When leaders at St. George's Methodist Church told Black members to sit in the balcony, Richard Allen responded, and not quite as covertly as he had with Stokely Sturgis.
He's a little more confrontational there. He stages the nation's first sit-in and walkout. Blacks walk into the segregated church on the main floor. They sit in the pews they're not supposed to. And when they're told to get up and leave, Richard Allen, in a very real way, challenged the entire congregation to confront their racism. And my belief is that if the congregation had said to church leaders, hey, African-American congregants are equal. They should be able to sit where they want. They're equal members in the eyes of God and the congregation. Then Richard Allen would have felt, great, this is my church home.
When that didn't happen, it was clear that African Americans needed to lead their own institutions.
Should we look at this sign, the Free African?
Yes.
So it's like, let's read about it.
Yeah, established in 1787 under the leadership of Richard Allen and Absalom Jones. This organization fostered identity, leadership, and unity among Blacks and became the forerunner of the first African American churches in this city.
That's the Free African Society plaque, founded in 1787.
Just 6 years before the yellow fever outbreak. One more historic event happened in 1793, right before yellow fever hit, the passing of the Fugitive Slave Act.
Which said if you escaped from plantation or farm, you could be picked up and put back into that farm, and the person who grabbed you got like $500 bounty for yourself.
Bounties weren't written into law, but many slaveholders offered them. And this was the worst-case scenario for the burgeoning free Black community. It was a constant looming threat of freedom being taken away because free Blacks weren't citizens. And that had been made clear by another historic event, the Constitution.
In the first articles was an article basically that said we were property. When they're talking about white people, it's those citizens. When they're talking about Black people, it's those people. We don't become citizens until after the Civil War. That's a fact. We're not citizens. This bothered us.
And now the scene is set. Yellow fever has taken hold of the city, and Benjamin Rush shows up asking Richard Allen and Absalom Jones to organize Black people as essential workers.
Rush depicts Black civic participation in the yellow fever as evidence not only of kind of scientific progress, but racial progress. He says, this is something that a righteous God has made available to us all, a disaster that needs Black aid workers to solve. So that will prove Black worth in the cosmos, but also in a kind of medical and scientific sense. He says, plus, you're immune, so what can it hurt you?
Don't forget that solitary belief. You've Black skin, you're in a Black body, and according to the scientific expertise of the day, your body is different. You won't be hurt or suffer like your white counterparts. And Rush dangles something else.
What he's really saying is that what we're really going to find out is if you want to participate in civic affairs, is if you're immune, then what would you do? Would you choose to step out in public or not? Because if you step out in public, you're going to prove your worth as citizens.
In his book, Richard Newman says that Benjamin Rush pushed all the right buttons to get Richard Allen to say yes. But this citizenship button was the biggest.
Anybody that was leading anything in the black community, that was the issue they had, that was the stomach was churning, that I'm not a citizen. I'm free, but I'm not a citizen.
Chapter 3, The Myth of Innate Racial Difference. Our second big question in the story, after why did Richard Allen say yes to Benjamin Rush, is why did Benjamin Rush ask him in the first place? How could Benjamin Rush, an abolitionist working to end slavery, push a blatantly racist theory? It makes me angry, yeah, but it also just confounds me.
Yeah, and you're not alone. This is Rana Hogarth, historian of medicine and author of the book Medicalizing Blackness.
You know, I first encountered him as this abolitionist patriot physician. I realized there was a story here about somebody who thought they were doing good, which is Benjamin Rush, calling upon his allies, Richard Allen and Absalom Jones. He thinks he's doing good, but he's actually kind of reifying race. You know, when he writes a letter that says there's, this fever that passes by people of your color, I kind of paused in the archive and was like, okay, I need to do something with this.
So we should pause here too and point out that Rush's assumption was rooted in a bit of logic. This is how David Barnes explains it.
So it's likely that enslaved people in the United States and in the colonies before the United States who had been infected as children, yellow fever is usually milder in children, that some people of African descent in the United States were in fact immune because they had been exposed as children in West Africa or perhaps in the West Indies, where yellow fever was more or less endemic.
But no one knew all of this in 1793, right? They were just assuming that black bodies were inherently different from white bodies.
Right. So this idea was just a given. Benjamin Rush has not come up with this idea in general, right? And we're going to go into this a lot this season, but this was literally being taught in medical schools at this time. So when Benjamin Rush was faced with this massive medical problem, he did what any other physician at the time would do. He read medical treatises of other doctors, and he took what they had observed as facts.
He goes back to the writings of John Lining, who was a physician who resided in Charleston, South Carolina, which had a very large population of people of African descent. And he makes this claim, right, this observation. There's something about the constitutions of the Negroes, the quote-unquote Negroes, that makes them not liable to this fever.
Even now, a doctor might start trying to make sense of an issue by reviewing a medical journal. Science is and always was done by people building on each other's work. And that's a good thing, mostly. In this case, it's part of the problem.
Yeah, it is. Or, maybe problem is too strong of a word. I think it's just something that we need to understand about the scientific record. But it does mean that sometimes information gets stuck because we just all keep repeating it. And then over time, scientific practices might change or we learn new things, but that original information is still stuck in the canon.
When I went to graduate school, there were these claims about, slavery is terrible, or the treatment of African Americans and Black people, it's terrible. And a lot of these ideas about difference or racial inferiority were just conjured up to support slavery. Physicians came up with these outlandish claims, pathologizing race, etc.
I have to confess that before I talked to Rana, this was pretty much my understanding too. But Rana questioned it when she heard it.
And I thought, okay, so all of these ideas were just meant to justify slavery, that they are easily dismissed as sort of the bad old days of slavery. And I thought, well, that seems odd because, slavery didn't always need to be defended. There was a time where people didn't even question slavery. And I thought, well, what did people think about race then? What did physicians think about race at that point?
So when Rana dug into the history, she discovered that yes, slavery obviously has to do with it. We're going to get into that more in the season 2. But it isn't always this direct line. It was more like a general frame of thought about Blackness that's been in the water since, well, for a very long time. And it continued to influence how scientists and doctors thought about race, even if they didn't realize it.
Benjamin Rush was opposed to slavery, very much so. But he did indeed, traffic in a kind of language that was basically pathologizing Blackness, that singled out Blackness as being something peculiar.
His ideas about so-called Black peculiarity were based on ideas of white supremacy. After yellow fever, he even argued that Blackness was a form of leprosy. It was a disease that doctors needed to cure so Black people could become white.
Which, I'm sorry, I have to add this. This is not the first thing you learn about Benjamin Rush, is it?
Of course not.
I think us sitting here reconciling what we know about what Rana said also has to do with how we're taught about slavery and the abolitionist movement. They're set up as these opposite ends of the spectrum, right? Abolitionism is presented as this absolute good, but the story really makes it clear that it only went so far. Emancipation didn't equal equality. And you could easily be anti-slavery and also anti-Black equality.
Exactly. And I want to add one more deep thought. It's not an accident that both the science of the time and the politics of the time said that Black people were inferior.
Right, exactly. I mean, listeners, are you listening? I dare you to ask us for a science story without culture and politics. It's not going to happen. I've said it a cajillion times, and I'll keep saying it. Science does not happen in a vacuum.
Just like Rush repeated lining when talking about yellow fever, people would go on to cite Rush even after it became clear that he was wrong. The original version of the theory stuck.
We might say that's 1793, is that an isolated incident? And it turns out, no. I found references to this in medical dissertations from Southern physicians. I quoted in the book, I think, where it's like 1830 or something like that, where this guy is saying, oh yeah, well, Benjamin Rush said X, Y, and Z, and let me explain, looking back as to why this is important.
When Benjamin Rush approached Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, it was with a sound, quote-unquote, scientific truth. Black bodies are different. They don't get yellow fever. And Allen and Jones rallied their community. And then the fall of 1793 hit. Chapter 4. Yellow fever comes to town. The fever hit during the hot, sticky summer of 1793. Benjamin Rush was the guy who thought it came from the rotting coffee beans on the wharf near Arch Street. He thought that the smell, or the miasma, was causing the illness. By September, it was heading towards its peak. Thomas Jefferson wrote to James Madison that everyone who could escape the city was doing so. But someone, as Richard Allen wrote, had to stay behind and care for the sick and dying.
Early in September, a solicitation appeared in the public papers to the people of color to come forward and assist the distressed, perishing, and neglected sick with a kind of assurance that people of our color were not liable to take the infection. It was our duty to do all the good we could to our suffering and fellow mortals.
The suffering was tremendous. By the end of September, an estimated 40% of the city had fled, including the people in charge. The College of Physicians published a letter in the city's newspapers, written by a committee headed by Rush, suggesting 11 measures to prevent the progress of the fever. These included avoiding fatigue, the hot sun, as well as the cool night air, too much liquor, and anything else that might lower their resistance. The most important measure was avoiding contact with the sick at all costs. Even doctors and nurses were falling ill, and help was needed.
We set out to see where we could be useful when a physician was not attainable. We have been the instruments in the hand of God for saving the lives of some hundreds of our suffering fellow mortals. We have been called to bury some who, when we came, we found alive. At other places, we found a parent dead, and none but little innocent babes to be seen. Their cries and the innocent confusion of the little ones seemed almost too much for human nature to bear.
Rush was using every tool in his kit, bleeding, purges, and anything he thought would bring down the fever and eliminate the excesses he thought were causing the disease. The Bush Hill Hospital, which housed the sick poor, was pitifully understaffed. Nurses and attendants complained of a lack of resources and support.
The dying and dead were indiscriminately mingled together. Not the smallest appearance of order or regularity existed. It was, in fact, a great human slaughterhouse, where numerous victims were immolated at the altar of intemperance.
As the cases climbed towards their peak in October, it became clear that Black people were not immune. 5,000 Philadelphians died, and though there's not accurate records of African American deaths, we know an estimated 10% of the free Black population also perished.
We can assure the public we have taken 4 and 5 Black people in a day to be buried. In several instances, when they have been seized with the sickness, while nursing, they have been turned out of the house and wandering and destitute until taking shelter wherever they could. They have languished alone.
Richard Allen himself got yellow fever and lay on his deathbed at Bush Hill. He pulled through and survived, but just barely. He lost a son. The Free African Society received a whopping $233.10 for its efforts. By the time they bought coffins, hired men to do the heavy lifting, paid for hearse carriages and transport, fed their families, and still gave money to the poor, they were over $170 in the hole. Before yellow fever, Richard Allen and Absalom Jones had taken out a loan from the Pennsylvania Abolitionist Society, which was run in part by Benjamin Rush. They had borrowed $50 to start a nail factory. With all the building in the new city, it seemed like a promising endeavor that could employ free Black men. They never got to build that nail factory. Their resources had been wiped out. And the Abolitionist Society never forgave their debt. Chapter 5, The Pamphlet Wars. Yellow fever finally went away when the weather turned cold, and there were no more mosquitoes to transmit the disease.
So now everybody's trying to get themselves together, and this young man named Matthew Carey comes along, and Matthew Carey was a businessman, and he decided maybe I need to print a story about what happened. Even though he left, he did not stay in Philadelphia during the yellow fever. But he comes back, and he printed 10,000 copies of his analysis of yellow fever. In his pamphlet was one paragraph that the Black community did not like.
Members of the Black community had just risked and in many cases given up their lives in hopes that white society might finally accept them. And in return, Matthew Carey accused them of price gouging and stealing.
I think the thing that needs to be said is he doesn't believe he's going to get challenged by African American writers or thinkers. So that's why he writes it. He thinks he's reporting on what friends told him during the yellow fever epidemic, but he wasn't there. So he's really reporting stereotypes, which means he's really contributing to the negative side of a race debate. He's trying to basically stir up questions about emancipation, saying, we should think about this. It's not just an easy process of right and wrong. And that bugs Richard Allen, who just thinks, how can we have these questions and these stereotypes at this point?
And he challenges Matthew Carey by publishing a response. Not only publishing it, he copyrights it, knowing that it's the first time an African-American author would do so.
The whole page is the title.
Let's see, it says, a narrative of the proceedings of the Black people during the late awful calamity in Philadelphia in the year 1793, and a refutation of some censures thrown upon them in some late publications. That's the whole title.
That's the title.
That's a heck of a title. The pamphlet is primarily a rebuttal, and Allen lays out in detail what the Black community dealt with during the epidemic. For one, he addressed Matthew Carey's price gouging accusations.
When the people of color had the sickness and died, we were imposed upon and told it was not with the prevailing sickness, until it became too notorious to be denied. Then we were told some few died, but not many. Thus were our services extorted at the peril of our lives. Yet you accuse us of extorting a little money from you. It is unpleasant for us to make these remarks, but justice to our color demands it.
We can't overstate this document's importance, not only from a civil rights perspective, but also a scientific one. It's a first-hand account of the conditions during the epidemic, and Allen uses the pamphlet to push back on so-called scientific beliefs about innate racial difference.
This is a good one. We believe if you would try the experiment of taking a few black children and cultivate their minds with the same care and let them have the same prospect in view as to living in the world as you would with your own children, you would find upon trial that they were not inferior in mental endowments.
Yeah.
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 Nothing to do with it. But it was an opportunity
Yes.
to put it out there. And that's what he did.
Well, it's in that moment he says, if you teach these kids, they're going to learn the exact same way.
He's talking about himself.
Right? He's talking about himself. He's like, yeah. He's refuting, I think, this, I'm going to say scientific, but I'm saying it in quotation marks.
Yeah.
The scientific belief of the day that black people were fundamentally different.
Yes.
And everything that he is writing in his pamphlet is saying.
And he actually says it.
Yeah.
He actually says it.
It is even to this day a generally received opinion in this city that our color was not so liable to the sickness as the whites. Happy would it have been for you, and much more for us, if this observation had been verified by our experience.
Benjamin Rush finally admitted he was wrong about the immunity myth.
But here's the thing, even though Benjamin Rush backtracks, he does make the statement that, well, they're not necessarily immune, but they don't suffer as badly. He quotes another physician who talks about black people being insensible to pain, right? That they don't seem to suffer as much. And so that for me was a moment where I said, okay, he's willing to admit being wrong, but he's also not entirely convinced that the experience of illness is the same amongst races.
During a major disaster, the secondary disaster of racism is always lurking. So we saw this with Hurricane Katrina. We saw this during COVID. No matter what you think you're confronting in terms of the explicit disaster or problem, it's going to expose these inner layers of racism in American culture.
Back at the Lazaretto, David Barnes told us the quarantine station was built to save the city after its fourth yellow fever outbreak.
And essentially what they were saying was, we promise you that this is going to be expensive, but it's going to work and you'll be proud of it. It was a defiant gesture, a refusal to simply die or fade away.
But in 1793, there was no Lazaretto. It was Black essential workers who were given fewer than no resources. And the hope was that by doing this, they would be deemed fully worthy of equality, of citizenship.
And so for the rest of his life, this is going to be in his mind an epic moment that he returns to. Is Philadelphia during the yellow fever the reality of America? That no matter how far you come forward, no matter what you do on the civil rights or emancipation front, you're always going to see that inner core of racism? Or will white as well as Black Philadelphians learn to live together?
After yellow fever, Richard Allen would oscillate between thinking things would finally get better and being so full of despair that the only solution he could think of was to leave the country.
And then at the end of his life, he kind of has another moment of reevaluation where he's going to claim America as his birthland. He says in a famous newspaper editorial in the 1820s in Freedom's Journal, first Black newspaper, this is our mother country. We've watered it with our tears and our blood. Everything that we've done to help build this country confers upon us equality of citizenship.
So Richard Allen is in this tomb.
We're in the basement of Mother Bethel, in a small room with a sign above our heads, Tomb of Bishop Richard Allen, born February 14, 1760, died March 26, 1831.
Would you read a little bit of it for us?
Let her read it.
You want to read a little bit of it?
To the memory of Reverend Richard Allen, first Bishop of the African Methodist Episcopal Connection in the United States of America and founder of this church, who was born in this city AD 1760, He was instrumental in the hands of the Lord in enlightening many thousands of his brethren, the descendants of Africa, and was the founder of the first African church in America, which was erected in Philadelphia AD 1793. I have fought the good fight. I have finished my course. I have kept the faith. Reader, go thou and do likewise.